Welcome back to True Crime and Tea, or welcome to True Crime and Tea if this is your first time here. We explore some of the darker corners of human behaviour with empathy, nuance, and a commitment to ethical storytelling. And today's story, we're diving into the case of Jerry Brudos, who was a serial offender active in Oregon between 1968 and 1969. His crimes were deeply intertwined with fetish behaviour, misogyny, and long-standing psychological disturbances. I do actually have tea today. Well, I don't have tea. I've got a caramel latte that I made myself. This episode is not about sensationalising the violence. It's about understanding how early experiences, untreated mental health issues, and systemic failures can converge in some of the most devastating ways. So, grab your tea, like I have done, settle in, and let's unpack the life, crimes, and psychology of Jerry Brudos. Jerry Brudos was born on January the 31st, 1939 in Webster, South Dakota. And he was the youngest child in a family where his mother made it very, very clear. She openly expressed that she was disappointed that Jerry wasn't the daughter that she wanted. She wanted a girl and he was not that. This resentment wasn't subtle at all. She belittled him, she favoured his older brother, and reportedly dressed him in girls' clothing during childhood. So she made it very, very obvious that she disliked the fact that Jerry was a boy. Now, dressing a child in clothing of another gender isn't inherently harmful and evil. But in this case, it was paired with humiliation, rejection, and emotional neglect. That is a combination that can distort a child's developing sense of self. Because they are so demonized for not being the gender that the parent wanted, they kind of lose the ability to work out what their identity is. As the family moved around the Pacific Northwest, Jerry's inner world grew increasingly troubled. By the age of 5, he had developed a fixation with women's shoes, which was a fetish that would later escalate to compulsive theft of shoes and lingerie. Now, having an obsession with your mum's shoes is not an issue. I'm very vividly remember my brothers, or one of my brothers, walking around in a pair of my mum's heels. That was not the issue. It was the issue that he had then developed that into a fetish that became dangerous. By his adolescence, the behaviour had increased and intensified. At the age of 17, he abducted a girl at knife point and forced her to undress for photographs. However, this is where there is a bit of a systemic failure, because instead of going to prison, he was committed to a psychiatric facility where he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. That in itself is not the failure. The failure is that after several months, not years, after several months of being at this mental health facility, he was released to the public, outside, for normal people that weren't murderers. So this is one of the first major systemic failures in his history. Early violent behaviour was clearly demonstrated, a serious mental health condition because he was schizophrenic, and yet very, very minimal long-term intervention. There was nothing that I could find that said there was any follow-up to the fact that he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, but there wasn't anything that said he had to go and check in and he was having regular mental health checks. I mean, this was the 40s and the 50s. So despite his psychiatric history, Brudos graduated high school in 1957. He became an electrician and he actually got married in 1961. His wife at the time was 17, significantly younger and reported to be quite submissive, which aligned with his need, his desire for control. He had to be in control. He is known to also have photographed his wife in high heels and lingerie, reenacting his fetishistic, it's really hard to say that word, his fetishistic fantasies that had shaped his adolescence. Now, obviously, consensual photography isn't inherently problematic. That was not the problem. But in Brudos's case, it reflected a growing pattern of objectification and domination. You taking a picture of your partner in, well, like your husband or your partner taking a picture of you in your lingerie and heels is not a bad thing. However, for Jerry, who had dark thoughts, that was problematic. This is evident because by the late 1960s, these fantasies that he was having, these fetishes and the scenarios that he was building in his head, these then escalated into violence. Between January of 1968 and April of 1969, 4 young women were murdered by Brudos, and the victims' names were Linda Slauson, who was a door-to-door saleswoman, Karen Sprinker, who was a 23-year-old student, Jan Whitney, I couldn't find much on, and Linda Saley. Brudos' methods followed a pattern: abduction, control, photography, and post-mortem manipulation. He kept trophies like shoes, lingerie, and in some cases he did keep body parts, hence the post-mortem mutilation, which he then used to reenact his fantasies. Now, in this episode, we're not going to detail the violence. What matters in this situation is the pattern: domination, objectification, and the transformation of women into props for his internal world, the world that he's made up in his head. This wasn't about sexual desire alone. Yes, that was part of his problem, but it was also about power. That's what domination is. It's about power, being able to be in control of a situation, something that he had none of when he was effectively being objectified by his mother and being humiliated by his mum. He was powerless, and he was effectively taking his power back, if that is even the right thing to say. Yeah. Brudos' downfall actually began with survivors, women who had escaped his attempted abductions, and provided police with detailed descriptions of the person that had attempted to abduct them. Because though there were 4 official homicides, there were some that managed to get away from him. Investigators connected these accounts with physical evidence found in his home and his garage workshop. They found photographs, stolen shoes, and items that belonged to the missing women. On May the 29th, 1969, he was arrested. So about a month after the last homicide. And he actually confessed to the homicide and was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences or life terms. You could say justice prevailed because life meant life in the case of Jerry Brudos. He died in prison in 2006 from liver cancer. When we look at this through an academic lens, we're going to take a few different concepts and ideas from the Jerry Brudos case. And the first idea is developmental psychology, early trauma and identity formation. Brudos' childhood included maternal rejection, emotional humiliation, gender-based shaming, and early fetish development. So the maternal rejection came in the way of his mother making it very, very clear she did not want a son again. She wanted a daughter. She wanted him to be a girl. And because of this maternal rejection, she then went on to humiliate him, dressing him up in girls' clothes, gender-based shaming. But then that led to Jerry Brudos's development of an early fetish. What research in developmental psychology shows is that chronic maternal rejection can distort attachment patterns. Humiliation during identity formation can lead to compensatory fantasies of power. In other words, because he was unable to, in reality, build an identity for himself that made sense, he then compensated by creating his own world of fantasy where he was in control, he had the power, he was the dominant being. Fetish development often begins in childhood. So from the early stages, we know by the age of 5 he had developed a fetish, but fetish alone does not cause violence. Those two things do not equal each other. Violence emerges when the fetish intersects with misogyny, trauma, and impaired empathy. He was effectively a misogynist because he was unable to respect, even like, women, and we can argue that's because of the way his mother treated him. But also, he probably had no empathy for these women because he was never shown empathy by a woman, namely his mother. That is the outcome of the way that his mother had treated him. She greatly contributed to the warped reality that fantasy that Brudos had created for himself. Brudos' fetish wasn't the cause of the problem, but it was the vehicle, the method through which deeper issues express themselves. He was able to use that as a foundation for everything else that he did. The second lens is criminology, the pathway to serial offending. He did not just commit murder. He was a thief, so he was a thief and an abuser. He was known to steal heels, lingerie, that kind of thing. And criminologists often examine fantasy rehearsal, escalation patterns, opportunity structures, and trophy taking. We know he did all 4 of those things because he did not just take the shoes and the lingerie from these women, he also took body parts from the women. So that is essentially, that's trophy taking. So Brudos exhibited all 4 of those concepts. His early photography offence at 17 was a clear precursor to what was about to come, and the lack of long-term intervention allowed his fantasies to grow unchecked. There was nobody that was ensuring that he was getting support for his schizophrenia, and therefore he was able to create these pockets, these different worlds, these different fantasies in his head that he convinced himself were acceptable, hence all of those 4 concepts. The other idea is gender studies, misogyny as a driving force. Brudos' worldview was shaped by a mother who rejected him, a belief that women were responsible for his suffering because the woman that should have loved him didn't. A desire to control, immobilize, and silence women. This aligns with patterns that are seen in gender-based violence. Women are dehumanized. Violence becomes a means of reclaiming perceived power. It's not actually power, it's perceived power. They think power should look like. And victims are chosen for accessibility, not for personal connection. And from what I was reading, a lot of the women that he abducted and unalived were easily accessible. I think the door-to-door saleswoman literally knocked on his door and she just walked into a trap. So there were easy methods of claiming victims. He did not have a personal connection to any of these women, probably because his only personal connection with a woman was his mother and his wife. He had no control over his mother. His wife he did control to some degree, but he didn't really care about anybody. And then the last lens is mental health, schizophrenia and responsibility. Now, schizophrenia does not mean violent offender. It's a mental health condition that a number of the population suffer with, but you don't see that number of the population running around and being homicidal maniacs. Schizophrenia is a managed, treated mental health condition. Brudos was diagnosed with schizophrenia. However, most people with schizophrenia are not violent. And I think in the media that is sometimes misconstrued and misrepresented, because you see the crazed schizophrenic running around like a madman. Those two things do not equal one another. You do not You're not violent because you're schizophrenic, and you're not schizophrenic because you're violent, if that makes sense. Most people with schizophrenia are not violent. Brutus was. His crimes were organised, planned, and methodical. And then his violence was aligned more with antisocial traits and paraphilic. And it's important, especially with this case, to not conflate mental illness with violence. You're not violent because you're mentally ill, and you're not mentally ill because you're violent. Those two things do not mean each other. His diagnosis explains part of his internal world, but not the misogyny or the cruelty. Yes, he had a mental health condition which can kind of explain his ability to have those fantasies so vivid in his mind, and probably explains why maybe because when I did the research, it didn't actually say if he had, auditory hallucinations, whether he saw things. It didn't go into that kind of detail. However, it can explain some of the foundation for him being able to create such vivid fantasies in his mind. And also to completely dehumanize the women so easily with no empathy whatsoever, because in his world, they were just a prop. This case, the Jerry Brudos case, highlights inadequate psychiatric follow-up. At 17, he only spent a couple of months in a mental health facility after assaulting another student. There was a lack of monitoring after early violent offences. And at the time, the 60s, there were social norms that really minimised women's safety. This was a time where women weren't really given the voice that we kind of have now. Dare I say, is it really improved? But the social norm was that they didn't really look into the safety of women. And it was also a culture that dismissed fetishistic red flags as quirky rather than concerning. You being into red heels as a man was just quirky behaviour, which essentially it kind of is. However, in the Jerry Brudos case, it was not quirky behaviour, it was concerning behaviour, given the trauma from his childhood and his upbringing, and what that fetish then led to, and how it contributed to the fantasies. Jerry Brudos' crimes didn't emerge out of nowhere. They did not just one day bubble cloud in his head. They were a result of trauma, untreated psychological issues, escalating fantasies, and a society that failed to intervene. But the most, what I would say, important part of the story is the victims. 4 young women whose lives were cut short because of somewhat of a systemic failure, and a mother who was, in my eyes, evil. And their names deserve to be remembered with dignity, not with how their lives ended. And this case also reminds us that early intervention matters. We always talk about intervention and prevention on True Crime and Tea. Early intervention matters. Listening to survivors matters. And understanding the psychology behind the violence is also essential if we want to prevent it. And understanding that one thing doesn't automatically mean the other. Schizophrenia does not mean violence. Mental illness does not mean violence. And that's it on True Crime and Tea for today. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you appreciate deep dives, academically grounded true crime that centers victims and challenges the harmful narratives that are sometimes put out there in the media, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell so you know when I release a new video. And as always, take care of yourselves, drink some tea, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye. It's been a hot minute. Oh my goodness. I have not recorded anything in about 6 weeks, and I'm having to re-record one of the original videos I recorded because I didn't like the way it had come out. The editing was doing my head in. Sometimes when I record, I have fun editing. Not sometimes, most of the time when I record, I have fun editing because I laugh at the little, jokes I make that never make the cut. So, you know, it's fun editing. The last video that I recorded, two of them actually, one of them I'm not using because I don't like the topic and I didn't like talking about the person, and the second one was recorded so badly that I gave up hope when it came to editing it, and I was also going through the depths of seasonal disorder. So yeah, if you have been on this channel long enough, you will have seen the last couple of videos were extremely sporadic because I was sick for about 3 months. I had no voice. I had 2 chest infections, and then because as a result of the chest infections, apparently I got laryngitis. Now, I do routinely get chest infections. Not routinely, I get like one every year, and it seems like for the past 3 years, I've also been getting laryngitis quite badly. I've had it like on and off before those 3 years, but the last 3 years, it's almost like a given I'm going to lose my voice. But this time round, it was just gone. The first episode lasted, it was gone for like 5 weeks. And then the second episode lasted about 3 weeks. However, both times I had uni, and my study days are very few and far between. So the study day that I had in December, no voice. 2 days of no voice. And then the study day that I had in February, that week is when my voice came back. That's what I've been dealing with. So your girl has been going through it. Literally, like the voice has not been kind to me at all. But yeah, a little catch up. What have I been up to? I am fully in the trenches of my doctoral studies. I just submitted my third paper, which, can I just say, took me 2 months to write. And when I say it took me 2 months to write, it's not because I was actually writing for 2 months. It's because I had 2 months of writer's block. So the same no voice. It's like the voice was blocking the writing, and because I have seasonal disorder, we were there as well. So I had a supervisory meeting in January, like the second week of January, and I submitted my paper on what day did I submit? The 5th of March. Yeah, and when I tell you, I started writing the paper after we had a lesson on decolonizing methodologies, not because of the lecture on decolonizing methodologies, but that lesson was the first week of February. So I actually started looking at literature that week. I had some before then, but I actually actively started looking at literature that week. So it would have been the second. That's a lie. It was not the second week of February, because the second week of February I was out of the country. So the third week, the week of the 23rd, that's when I started looking at literature, because I then got a bit of my enthusiasm back. And from the week of the 23rd up until the 5th, I was researching and writing, and finally submitted on the 5th of March. Am I happy with this one? I'm a bit happier with this one than I have been about the previous two. But I'm seeing rhetoric come true. There's a lot of kind of people that speak online about their PhD and doctoral journeys, and they say it's quite a lonely journey. And I'm seeing it. I'm actually seeing it. And this is coming from someone that did her master's completely online. My whole master's was distance learning. But I think the fact that I was already in the mindset that it was distance learning, it didn't bother me as much. But I think with this doctorate, we have lectures. Like, we go in once every couple of months for lectures, and I have a cohort of students that I'm supposed to be working closely with. However, there's three of us. We all have very, very busy lives. Two of us are mothers and we work full time. It is not for the faint-hearted. The doctoral journey it's lonely. It's lonely, and I'm gonna take a bit of a liberty and say maybe it's less lonely if you are just doing your PhD, or if you're, professional doctors, you have to be working. So if you are just doing your PhD 100% of the time, you are a full-time PhD student and you're going into like the labs and stuff like that, maybe it's not as lonely as this journey. But the isolation is there a little bit, and you really have to be motivated to get up and do something. Very, very self-motivated. Nobody is telling you when to submit assignments. This whole time in between my last supervision and my next supervision, which is happening the week of the 9th of March, there's been no communication from my supervisor at all, like no check-ins or nothing. And that's normal. That's not to say why hasn't she checked in on me, or why haven't they checked in on me. I have seen one of my supervisors because they were at the lecture days. However, it's yeah. It's lonely over here. But anyway, we're here for True Crime and Tea, so let's get into the intro.